The wine hit her chest before the room even stopped talking. Red, sudden, and deliberate, it spread across white silk like a wound opening in slow motion. 200 guests froze mid-sentence. Crystal glasses hovered in the air. Somewhere near the string quartet, a bow scraped to a stop against a violin string, and the silence that followed was so complete you could hear the ice settling in someone's drink. Elena Ward stood perfectly still in the middle of the Cross family ballroom, wine dripping from the hem of a dress that was not supposed to matter to anyone but her. Why did a maid's dress matter enough to stop a billionaire's engagement party in its tracks? Why did Julian Cross, the man everyone in that room had come to celebrate, set down his champagne glass so carefully, as if any sudden movement might shatter something far more fragile than crystal? Why did his jaw tighten the moment he saw the pattern of small embroidered violets along the collar of that ruined dress? Why did his bride-to-be, Vivian Ashcroft, smile the way people smile when they believe they have already won? And why, only 40 seconds later, would Julian Cross stand in front of every important person in his life and say 5 words that would end the wedding before it had even truly begun? Nobody in that ballroom knew the answers yet, not the guests, not the photographers hired to capture the happiest night of Vivian's life, not even Elena, who had spent the last 3 years cleaning floors in this very mansion and had never once imagined that a stain on her uniform could unravel a fortune.
But some accidents are not accidents at all. Some humiliations are the beginning of a reckoning nobody saw coming. This is the story of how one moment of cruelty exposed a lie that had been growing for years, and how a woman who asked for nothing ended up changing everything. 3 hours earlier, the Cross estate had been alive with preparation. Gardeners trimmed hedges into perfect geometric shapes. Waitstaff polished silver until it threw back the afternoon light like small suns. Elena had been assigned to the West Wing that evening, folding linens and making sure every guest room smelled of lavender and cedar, the way Julian's mother had always preferred it before she passed. Elena had never met Margaret Cross. The older woman had died 2 years before Elena was hired, but she had heard stories from the older staff, from the butler, Thomas, who had worked for the family for over 30 years and still spoke of Margaret with a softness in his voice that no one else in that house seemed to inspire. "She would have liked you," Thomas told Elena once, watching her carefully refold a stack of towels that were already perfectly folded. "She had a rule: kindness first, status never. You remind me of her." Elena had smiled and said nothing, because what was there to say? She was a maid. Kindness was easy to offer when you had nothing else to give. What Elena did not know, what nobody in that house except Thomas and one aging attorney knew, was that Margaret Cross had left behind more than memories. By 7 that evening, the ballroom had filled with the kind of people whose names appeared in financial newspapers: senators, museum donors, the heads of 3 different shipping conglomerates. And at the center of it all stood Julian Cross, 34 years old, heir to a logistics empire his grandfather built from a single tugboat, dressed in a black suit that had been tailored twice because he kept losing weight from stress he never spoke about out loud. Beside him stood Vivian Ashcroft, radiant in white, already dressed like a bride 6 months before the actual wedding, because Vivian believed that if you wanted something badly enough, you announced it to the world before it was real. She had wanted this night to be about her. She had wanted every photograph to show her hand on Julian's arm, her ring catching the light, her name whispered by people who mattered. She had not wanted a maid walking past the dessert table carrying a tray of champagne flutes. "You," Vivian said, her voice cutting cleanly through the ambient chatter of the party. "What are you doing near the guests?" Elena stopped, tray balanced carefully in both hands. "I was asked to refill the glasses near the terrace, ma'am." "Asked by who?" "The events coordinator." Vivian's eyes moved slowly down Elena's simple black uniform, then up again, lingering just long enough to make the intention clear. A few nearby guests had already turned to watch, sensing the shift in the air the way people sense a storm before the first drop of rain. "You're standing too close to my guests," Vivian said. "This isn't a servant's hallway." "Of course," Elena said quietly. "I'll move." She should have been allowed to simply walk away. That would have been the end of it, a small unkindness lost in the noise of a large party. But Vivian had an audience now, and Vivian had never once in her life resisted an audience.
Actually, Vivian said, reaching for a fresh glass of red wine from a nearby tray, let's make sure everyone remembers where the help stands in this house. She tipped the glass forward with a smile still fixed on her face, and the wine arced through the air in a deliberate, unhurried motion, splashing across the front of Elena's dress in a spreading crimson stain. Laughter did not come. Instead came a heavy, uncomfortable hush, the kind that spreads through a crowd when people realize they have just witnessed something they cannot unsee. Elena did not cry out. She did not drop the tray. She stood very still, wine soaking into fabric, and looked down at the stain with an expression that was somehow more unsettling than tears would have been. It was recognition, not of the insult, but of something else entirely, something only she seemed to understand in that moment. Because the dress Elena was wearing was not standard staff uniform. It was a modest black dress with a narrow collar embroidered in small violet flowers, a dress she had been given years ago as a gift, a dress she had been asked never to wear to work, but had put on tonight almost as a private act of quiet remembrance, unaware that anyone would notice, unaware that everything was about to change because of it. Julian noticed. He had been mid-conversation with a shipping executive about port expansion in Long Beach, half listening, the way people do at their own engagement parties when their mind is elsewhere. But the moment the wine hit that dress, his entire body turned toward the sound, and something in his expression shifted from polite host to a man who had just seen a ghost standing in the middle of his ballroom.
He crossed the floor in seconds. Guests parted instinctively, sensing the urgency in his stride. "Elena," he said, and the use of her first name, spoken with a familiarity that surprised even the household staff who had worked there for years, made Vivian's smile falter for the first time that night. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine, sir," Elena said. "It was an accident." "It wasn't an accident," said an older woman near the dessert table, one of the museum donors, who had clearly had enough wine to speak freely. "We all saw her throw it." Julian's eyes moved to Vivian. "Did you do this?" Vivian laughed, a bright, brittle sound meant to diffuse the tension. "Julian, it's just a work uniform. I'll buy her a new one. Honestly, you're making this into something it isn't." "That's not a work uniform," Julian said quietly. The words landed strangely in the room, heavier than their length should have allowed. Even Elena looked up at him with something like alarm. "What do you mean it's not a work uniform?" Vivian said, laughing again, though this time it carried an edge. "It's black, it's plain. Of course it's a uniform." Julian did not answer her directly. Instead, he reached toward Elena's collar, not touching her, simply gesturing at the small embroidered violets along the neckline, his hand trembling slightly. "My mother embroidered these herself," he said. "There were only 2 dresses like this ever made. One is buried with her. The other one—" He stopped. His throat worked as though the next words physically cost him something. "The other one was given to a little girl named Elena Ward 18 years ago, at a hospital in Portland, by a woman who told her she would come back for her one day." The room went utterly silent. Vivian's face drained of color, though she quickly forced her expression back into composure. "That's absurd," she said. "You're telling me the maid and your mother had some kind of connection? Julian, you're embarrassing yourself." But Julian wasn't looking at Vivian anymore. He was looking at Elena, whose eyes had filled with tears she was fighting hard not to let fall in front of 200 strangers. "You remember," Elena whispered. "I've been looking for you for 2 years, Julian said, since my mother's will named a beneficiary I never met, a woman whose location the estate lawyers could not confirm because the paperwork listed only a first name and a hospital record that had been sealed." Somewhere in the back of the ballroom, a phone camera was already recording, though no one seemed to care anymore about appearances. "What paperwork?" Vivian said, her voice sharper now, less composed. "What are you talking about?" Julian turned to her slowly, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, in the particular way that frightening things are often calm. "You knew," he said, "didn't you? To understand what happened next, you have to go back 2 years, before the engagement, before Vivian, before any of the polished appearances that had built the version of Julian Cross the public believed they knew. Margaret Cross had spent the final year of her life in and out of hospitals, quietly, without press coverage,
without the kind of sympathetic headlines that usually followed people of her wealth and standing. She had insisted on privacy, and Julian had honored that, even when it meant carrying the weight of her illness largely alone. During one of her final hospital stays, in a maternity and pediatric wing where she had gone to visit a friend's newborn grandchild, Margaret had crossed paths with a terrified 16-year-old girl who had just given birth to a daughter she could not keep. A girl with no family in the waiting room, no support, nothing but a hospital blanket, and a decision that was breaking her from the inside out. That girl was not Elena. That girl was Elena's mother. Margaret had sat with her for hours, had held her hand while she signed papers she did not fully understand, had promised, in a moment of grief and compassion neither of them expected, that the baby, whoever she became, would never be forgotten. The girl, barely older than a child herself, had wanted to keep her daughter more than anything in the world, but she had no home, no income, and no family willing to help her try. Margaret never told her what to do. She simply sat beside her, held the baby once, briefly, and made a promise that had nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with a choice she made freely in a hallway that smelled of antiseptic and fear, to make sure that little girl never grew up believing she had been forgotten. Margaret paid quietly for years of anonymous support through a trust nobody at Cross Logistics knew existed, structured deliberately so it could never be traced back to the family name, because Margaret had learned early in her life that money given publicly often did more harm than good. She sent gifts through intermediaries. She checked in through a social worker she trusted completely, reading quiet updates about a child moving through foster placements, a child who kept her grades steady even when her circumstances were anything but stable. And on Elena's 18th birthday, the day the system would formally stop watching over her, Margaret had traveled, alone and unannounced, to see the young woman her quiet generosity had helped raise. She had given Elena the dress that day, told her cryptically that if she ever needed anything, truly anything, she should come find the Cross family and that she would always have a place there. Elena, proud and unwilling to accept charity she didn't fully understand, had thanked her and said she wanted to build her own life first. She had no idea at the time that the kind older woman who visited her that single afternoon was dying, or that she would never get the chance to say more. Margaret passed away 8 months later. Buried in her will, alongside instructions for the company and the estate, was a clause naming a woman named Elena Ward, birth record sealed, last known location a group home in Oregon, as beneficiary of a private trust worth $11 million, along with a personal letter that Julian had never been permitted to open, per his mother's explicit instructions, until the beneficiary was found. Julian had spent 2 years searching quietly through investigators and lawyers, hitting dead ends at every sealed record, every changed address, every name that led nowhere. He had almost given up. He had never imagined she would already be working in his own house. Because here was the truth that made the entire ballroom go cold. 3 years ago, when Elena applied for a housekeeping position at the Cross estate through a staffing agency, her file had crossed the desk of the head of housekeeping staffing, a woman named Renata Cole, who happened to also work closely, quietly, and financially with Vivian Ashcroft. Vivian had discovered the trust's existence 18 months earlier, during a period when she was dating Julian and had access, briefly and carelessly granted, to family documents while helping plan a memorial gala for Margaret. She had seen the sealed name. She had done what people like Vivian always do when they discover a threat to something they believe they deserve. She buried it. She paid Renata to make sure that if a woman named Elena Ward ever applied for any position within 100 miles of the Cross family, her application would be quietly filtered, redirected, delayed, or denied, so that she would never come face to face with Julian, never learn about the inheritance, never disrupt the future Vivian had already mapped out for herself as the next Mrs. Cross. What Vivian had not accounted for was one clerical oversight. Renata had left the company 8 months into the arrangement, replaced by a new staffing coordinator who had no idea about the secret filtering system and had simply hired the most qualified, most reliable candidate for the West Wing housekeeping position, Elena Ward, hired legitimately, living under Julian's roof for nearly 3 years, cleaning the halls of a house that legally owed her millions of dollars, completely unaware, while the woman planning to marry the heir of that fortune had known the entire time and said nothing. "You knew she worked here," Julian said again, his voice low and dangerously steady. "You've known for years." "I don't know what you're talking about," Vivian said, though her voice cracked in the middle of the sentence. "Renata Cole," Julian said. "I had our security team pull staffing records after my mother's memorial, when I noticed some names had been flagged for exclusion during hiring reviews. I thought it was a data error. I never imagined it was you." A woman near the back of the crowd, one of Vivian's own bridesmaids, went very pale and quietly set down her drink, stepping back as if trying to physically distance herself from what was unfolding. "Julian, please," Vivian said, her composure cracking fully now, tears rising that seemed, even to those watching closely, uncertain whether they were genuine or performed. "You threw wine on a woman my mother loved," Julian said, in front of everyone. "I think we're past privately." Thomas, the butler who had known Margaret Cross for 30 years, stepped forward from where he had been quietly observing near the terrace doors. In his hand was a small leather folder that he had, without anyone noticing, retrieved from Julian's study the moment the confrontation began, as though some old instinct told him this night might finally be the one Margaret had been waiting for. "Sir," Thomas said gently, "perhaps now is the time." Julian looked at the folder, then at Elena, whose wine-soaked dress still clung to her, whose eyes were still wide with a kind of shock that had nothing to do with the humiliation and everything to do with hearing, for the first time, why a woman she barely remembered had once told a frightened teenager that she would always have a place to belong. "This is my mother's letter," Julian said, holding it toward Elena, though he did not yet open it. "She wrote it for you, not for me. I was only ever meant to deliver it." Elena's hands trembled as she took the folder. The ballroom, once filled with polite chatter and clinking glasses, had become a silent audience to something none of them would ever forget, an entire fortune's worth of secrets unraveling in real time between the wedding cake and the string quartet.
Vivian, sensing the ground shifting irreversibly beneath her, made one final attempt to regain control. "None of this changes anything between us," she said, reaching for Julian's arm. "I made a mistake. I panicked because I was afraid of losing you to some stranger with a sad story. That's not a crime, Julian. That's fear. That's love." Julian looked at her hand on his arm for a long moment, then gently stepped back, out of reach. "You didn't panic tonight," he said. "You've had 18 months to tell me the truth, and instead you paid someone to bury it. Tonight wasn't fear. Tonight was cruelty. And it just happened to be the kind of cruelty that finally showed me who you really are." He turned to the room, to the 200 guests who had come expecting champagne toasts and photographs, and he said the 5 words that would be repeated in whispered conversations across the city for weeks to come. "The wedding is off, permanently." Vivian did not scream. She did not cry the way people expected. Instead, something colder settled over her face, the look of someone recalculating, already searching for the next angle, the next room to walk into where her name still opened doors. She found one, briefly, the very next morning. Before Julian had even finished drafting the formal statement his lawyers would release to the small circle of press already circling the story, Vivian arrived at the estate unannounced, demanding to speak with the head of security. She claimed that a valuable heirloom bracelet, one she said had been a gift from Julian's late mother, had gone missing from the guest suite she used during wedding preparations, and she suggested, pointedly, that the only person with regular access to that wing was the housekeeping staff assigned there. Elena. For a tense afternoon, it worked exactly as Vivian intended. Security reviewed entry logs. A junior staff member, eager to be helpful and unaware of the larger situation unfolding around them, mentioned that Elena had indeed been in that hallway the previous evening. Whispers moved quickly through the household, the way they always do, faster than facts, faster than fairness. Elena said nothing in her own defense beyond the truth. She had entered the room only to deliver fresh linens. She had touched nothing else. She asked, calmly, whether the security cameras installed in the East Corridor 18 months earlier, after a string of minor thefts from visiting guests, might simply be reviewed before anyone drew conclusions. The footage told a different story than the one Vivian was hoping for. It showed Elena entering and leaving within 90 seconds, exactly as she described. It also showed, 20 minutes earlier, Vivian herself entering the same suite carrying a small velvet pouch and leaving without it, only to return hours later and leave again with the pouch clearly visible in her hand. The same pouch security later confirmed matched the description of the missing bracelet's case. Vivian had staged the theft herself, hoping to have Elena removed from the property, quietly discredited, and ideally arrested,
before Julian had time to process everything he had learned the night before. It was, Julian realized with a kind of exhausted disbelief, not even her first attempt to erase Elena from his life. It was simply the most desperate one. He did not press charges. Elena asked him not to, saying she wanted no part of the same instinct for public humiliation that had driven Vivian to hurt her in the first place. But the attempted frame changed something in Julian's legal strategy. His attorneys, once handling a straightforward inheritance matter and an ended engagement, now began building a far more serious case, one that would eventually reach beyond Vivian and into the staffing scheme itself. Because within a week, security footage from the gala, along with sworn statements from 3 staff members who had grown tired of pretending not to notice years of Vivian's quiet cruelty, made their way to Julian's legal team. The staffing filtering scheme was uncovered fully, indicating not just Renata Cole, who had already left the company, but was now facing serious legal exposure for accepting money to manipulate employment decisions, in a way that had, however unintentionally, delayed a rightful heir from claiming what was owed to her for years.
Renata Cole, the former staffing coordinator, agreed to cooperate with Julian's legal team rather than face a lengthier civil dispute on her own. In a quiet deposition, she admitted that Vivian had paid her in 3 separate installments over the course of 18 months, always in cash, always with instructions delivered verbally rather than in writing, to ensure nothing could ever be traced. Renata claimed, tearfully, that she had not fully understood what she was hiding, only that a wealthy young woman wanted certain applicants filtered out of consideration. She said she told herself it was a small thing, a minor favor, the kind of quiet compromise people make when someone with money and confidence asks them to look the other way. It was not until she read about the inheritance in the news, she said, that she understood how much damage her silence had caused, and how many years it had cost a young woman who had every right to know she was never forgotten. Vivian's family, prominent but not nearly as wealthy as the image she had carefully constructed suggested, distanced themselves quickly once the story broke, unwilling to be associated with the scandal now attached to her name. Invitations to the events she once dominated stopped arriving. The circle that had once orbited her, drawn by proximity to the cross-fortune, evaporated within a season, the way certain kinds of friendship always do when the money and status attached to them disappear. Elena, meanwhile, sat in Julian's study 3 days after the party, the lever folder open in front of her, reading her final words from a woman she had met only once, briefly, on the happiest and hardest day of her young life. The letter was simple. It spoke of a promise made in a hospital hallway to a frightened teenage mother. It spoke of watching, quietly and from a distance, as that mother's daughter grew into someone kind, despite a childhood that gave her every reason not to be. It spoke of hope that one day, Elena would walk through the doors of the Cross estate not as a stranger, but as someone who finally understood she had never been forgotten. It ended with a single line that Elena would eventually have framed and hung in her own home. Kindness is never wasted, even when no one is watching. Elena did not immediately accept the full inheritance. She met with Julian's estate attorneys, asked careful, measured questions, insisted on understanding every clause before signing anything, a caution born from a life that had taught her nothing came with strings attached. When she finally did accept the trust, she used a significant portion of it to fund transitional housing programs for young mothers aging out of foster care, quietly, without press releases, in the same anonymous spirit Margaret Cross had once shown her. She did not immediately quit her position at the estate either, something that surprised the household staff far more than the revelation of her inheritance had. She stayed on for another 2 months, finishing training the newer housekeeping staff, insisting on proper handoffs, refusing to simply vanish from a life and a house that, despite everything, had given her stability during a difficult chapter. Julian, for his part, spent those months doing something he had never truly done before. He listened. He asked Elena at Asta Life, her mother, the years she had spent bouncing between group homes before aging out at 18 with nothing but a single dress and a promise from a stranger. He learned, slowly, that the woman who had been cleaning his floors for 3 years possessed a quiet strength and clarity of judgment that made every conversation with her feel more honest than the 18 months he had spent with Vivian. Their relationship, when it eventually became something more than employer and employee, grew slowly and carefully, without press coverage or grand gestures, the opposite of everything Vivian had once staged for cameras. When Julian finally asked Elena to marry him a 1.5 years later,
In the same garden where his mother used to sit each morning with her coffee, he did not do it in front of 200 strangers. He did it in front of exactly 2 people. Thomas, who had waited 3 decades to see Margaret's final wish fulfilled, and Elena's own daughter, born quietly during a difficult chapter of her own life years earlier, and raised with the same fierce determination Elena's mother once showed on that hospital bed. A little girl who would, in time, wear a small dress with embroidered violets sewn by hand, a tradition passed down not through blood, but through kindness that refused to end with one generation.
The wedding, when it eventually happened, was small. No wine was spilled that night. No cameras captured false smiles for magazine spreads. Instead, in a quiet garden ceremony attended by household staff who had become something closer to family, Elena Ward became Elena Cross. Not because a billionaire had rescued her, but because 2 people who had both learned the cost of cruelty chose deliberately to build something gentler. Vivian Ashcroft, last anyone in that circle heard, had moved to another city, working a job far removed from the world of galas and inheritance, learning slowly and painfully the lesson Margaret Cross had tried to teach a room full of wealthy strangers with a single sentence years before any of this began. Status without kindness is worth nothing at all. And somewhere in the Cross family archives, framed now in Elena's own study, sits a single letter, the ink slightly faded, the promise inside it finally, completely fulfilled. If this story moved you, you're not alone. Stories like Elena's remind us that kindness, even the quiet kind nobody notices, has a way of finding its way back to us. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this one, please consider giving it a like, subscribing for more stories like this, and letting me know in the comments which moment hit you hardest. I'll see you in the next story.